everyone has their own thoughts and beliefs, right? We're all good.
That's the beauty of it. Yes.
That is the beauty, and that's the beauty of our country. And ultimately, that's the beauty of history and historic preservation, which brings us together today.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, the past happened, and what we remember, and takes front stage into the future, how we shape policy and ultimately how we drive conversations. And for us today, especially, what I want to jump into is historic preservation. Amber, I don't know how much Chris shared with you, but right now I'm focused on helping developers and folks in the real estate industry analyze and underwrite their real estate projects. And especially in today's environment with tariffs and inflation, cost increases, groups are trying to figure out how to make real estate projects work from an investment perspective. And one really unique way of doing so is through historic tax credits. So Chris had a great idea and suggested that we chat and learn a little more from the expert about how tax credits work on a federal level, on a state level, and how groups might implement them to be more efficient, and how cities and municipalities, by leveraging them with developers, can help create a more vibrant community that tells a fuller story.
Absolutely. You're not based in Utah, right? You're out in New York, was it?
So I'm currently in New York.
Okay.
I live in San Diego, but I will be, and I'm from Florida, so touching all the corners, right? And then I will be in New York City full-time June 1st of this year.
Okay. I'm just mostly trying to think if I should be generic with the state tax credit discussion, because each state is different.
Yes. I think what would be great is if we started with a general understanding of the federal tax credit program, and then transition to an overarching explanation of state tax credits. To your point, they're all different, right? Is there anything that unifies them? What are the main points that differentiate them from one another? And then ultimately, I think it would be great if we jumped into Utah specific, because we're here, right?
Sure. Yeah. Sounds good.
I'm just going to be lurking, but I'm just happy that all 50 states and 9 territories and protectorates have a state historic preservation office, and they are each state or territory's touch point for what preservation options there are in that state of which a person resides or a business is moving into. And so one of the biggest things we try to do is provide technical assistance, background information, direction, and we also get to administer some really cool programs like the historic tax credits here in Utah. So you are in good hands with Amber. I will pass you off to her.
And very quickly, Chris Merritt is Utah State Historic Preservation Officer. So that is why he is so knowledgeable when it comes to all things historic preservation.
Yep.
Thank you for that, Spencer. I always forget to introduce myself.
Thanks for setting up this call as well. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to get the message out there. Happy for good partners like yourself. And just, there's not a lot of us that do preservation when you think about the number of people, but there are a lot of preservationists that don't even know it yet, that can see themselves preserving cool historic buildings through programs like this, and they will become preservationists, even if right now they don't even know what that means.
Love it. Completely agree. Well, Chris, thanks again. And Amber, we're really excited to hear more about the federal historic preservation program and the state historic preservation programs as well.
All right, sounds good. So, yep, I'm Amber Anderson. I have overseen the historic tax credit programs for the Utah State Historic Preservation Office for just over 7 years now. So I've seen quite a few different projects come through my desk in that amount of time. So I oversee both the federal and the state programs here. The federal program is administered by the National Park Service back in DC, but our office serves as a liaison to kind of help facilitate the process. We do the first line of review, but we also help applicants understand the program. We go on site visits, talk about appropriate work treatment items, things like that. So the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program provides an a federal income tax credit equivalent to about 20% of a project's costs. It's 20% of their qualified costs, which we don't need to get into, but qualified costs are most of the costs associated with the physical work being done to a historic building. So 20% of those back as an income tax credit. The building has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That can either be individually or as a contributing property in a historic district. And most of the projects we see are contributing properties in historic districts, honestly. Either that or they're getting listed on the National Register in order to make use of tax credits. Sometimes we have one that's already listed, but oftentimes that's what's happening. It's in a district or it's getting listed for that specific purpose. And also because it's eligible to be listed, not just because they want tax credits. It doesn't work that way. But
very quickly, how does a project become eligible to be listed and what does the listing process look like?
Yeah, so we have a National Register coordinator in our office who could go a deep dive, but I have a general understanding. So the building has to be at least 50 years old and it has to have enough historic integrity, meaning enough of the original fabric to convey the sense of the property, the history of the property. And then it also has to have an area of significance. And there are 4 different criteria under which it can have significance. It can have one or multiple. Criterion A is association with a pattern of history. Criterion B is association with an important person in history. Criterion C is architectural or engineering design significance. And the criterion D is typically more related to archaeology or the potential to help us learn more about the past, essentially. And so that's a whole separate process of doing research, documentation, putting a nomination together, and then it gets reviewed to make sure that it adequately conveys enough significance to be listed on the National Register. And then there's a process that, the National Park Service reviews it. It goes to the keeper of the National Register. There we go. Yeah. So if a building is getting individually listed on the National Register, that's the process. It's similar for a historic district, but if a whole district is getting listed and going through that process, then each individual building only has to be evaluated as contributing or not contributing. And if it's contributing, they meet the requirements to apply for things like tax credits.
Great, thanks. And what does the timeline typically look like? And if there's no typical timeline, is there a range?
So for the National Register listing process, it takes a minimum of a couple of months. If somebody is really quick to put the nomination together, it's going to take at least 45 days in our office, I believe. And then after that, it's at least 45 days in the national office. There's usually quite a bit of back and forth in terms of making edits and things like that. For the tax credit application, it's 30-day reviews. Our office has 30 days. The National Park Service has 30 days. But then again, there is some back and forth, and it often depends. The amount of time it takes usually is dependent on the applicant and how quickly they can get an application together, how quickly they can respond to comments, things like that.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, but so the federal program, it has to be listed on the National Register. The building has to have an income producing use for the federal tax credit program. So that might be commercial, that might be residential rental, entertainment venue, things like that. And then also the applicant has to be respending the value of the building. Essentially, it's a substantial rehab that has to happen. So there's a calculation for that, for calculating the value of the building. If you've owned it longer, the calculation is less, so it's easier to meet that requirement. But if it's a brand new purchase, which oftentimes it is, it's literally just purchase price of the property minus the value of the land. So it's a pretty high dollar amount most of the time, depending on the part of the country that the building is in. And then the fourth major requirement is that all work being done to the property, whether you want credit for it or not, inside and outside, has to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And those are 10 relatively vague standards because they're meant to be applied to all different types of buildings, ages, styles, uses, all the different things. It helps us understand what are the character defining features of this property, how do we preserve them, or how do we complement them in the best way possible. And the National Park Service does have a ton of guidance on how to implement those 10 relatively vague standards. They have a whole preservation by topic website where you can go through in alphabetical order and say, hey, I have a question about masonry. So you go to M and you scroll down, and then there's 25 pages of different questions you might have about masonry, how to repoint brick, how to clean paint off of or graffiti off of masonry. Anything you can think of is on that website. So it's a super helpful resource.
That's great.
Yeah, so those are the 4 main requirements. The application process is either 2 or 3 parts, depending on if a building is individually listed on the register or not. If it's already individually listed, there's only 2 parts. Part 2 is the before application. Part 3 is the after application. If it's in a district, there's an additional part at the beginning, but it's a pretty simple part. And one of the most important things is to know that applying and having an approved work plan before starting any work on the building is the best way forward. It's legally, you could do work on the building before you get it approved, but if you do any work that doesn't meet the standards, you could disqualify yourself. And if it's not something you can reverse, then you might not be able to apply for the program. So ideally, you get a work plan on a Part 2 application approved by the National Park Service before you touch anything.
Got it. And when a developer is putting together their application or their package, are there certain things that they can keep in the back of their mind that will give them a better chance of getting that application approved or bringing that application to the top of the pile so that your job, Amber, is easier when reading through the application?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I wouldn't say any of them bring it to the top of the pile necessarily, just because it's, first come, first serve in terms of the review timeline. But in terms of making things easier, definitely, as long as, the work needs to meet the standards. So being familiar with the preservation standards is tip number 1, I would say. Most contractors, architects are well-meaning, but they don't necessarily understand how we would require a historic building to be treated, both in terms of maintaining the historic significance, but also just dealing with older building materials. They don't work the same way as modern building materials. So if you slap some Portland cement on a soft brick, it's going to hurt it. It's going to deteriorate it faster. And a lot of people don't understand that. They would recommend doing a treatment that's not great for it. So first step would be to start to familiarize yourself with preservation best practices. And that's where that preservation by topic website is an excellent resource.
And Amber, people spend their entire careers focused on historic preservation, right? So if someone acquires a historic home or a historic building and then is looking to do the preservation work, it sounds like you and your team in the National Park Service have phenomenal resources. But at the end of the day, it sounds like there's a lot of information out there. So are there things you would recommend for developers to do, or maybe consultants you'd recommend for developers to contact?
We in our office can't recommend consultants or contractors, but yeah, there are definitely contractors, architects, consultants who know what they're doing and could be invaluable resources to projects.
Understood.
And Amber, while we're on the topic of, helping somebody who's perhaps entering the world of historic rehab from a low background or a low knowledge, what are some common pitfalls that you've seen in your career of projects that didn't work out because they focused on this type of activity that just pretty much out the gate a non-starter? I'm trying to think right now. In the preservation world, windows are such a fundamental part of historic buildings. They're the eyes of the building, but they are one of those very highly targeted parts of a rehab project too. So in that vein, Amber, do you want to talk about some of those common pitfalls or ways of like, oh, windows, we understand you need them replaced or repaired. Don't go this route, go this route. That kind of a discussion.
Yeah, it all kind of falls into respecting the historic character and materials. Oftentimes it's misunderstood. There's misguided attempts to improve a building and thinking that means you have to get rid of the old materials, which kind of defeats the purpose. And so like what Chris was saying, windows are a huge one. Old windows get a really bad rap, and sometimes they are too far gone. I'll admit that, but a lot of times old wood windows in particular can be made more energy efficient. They can be repaired indefinitely. So it's not like a modern window where if it breaks, you just have to get a new one. So we highly encourage retaining windows if at all possible, because they are, like Chris said, the eyes of a building. They convey so much historic character and the hand craftsmanship that somebody built them by hand, 100, 200 years ago. So that's our first priority, is maintaining those historic features like windows. But if they really just do have to be replaced, they need to be replaced with a really good match. And that's the same with other features as well. But windows are probably the number one thing. So it can't just be a vinyl window. You can't throw a slider in where there was a double hung wood window. It has to be a really good match, because we still want to convey the historic character, the historic use, all of that when carrying forward.
And Amber, for instance, what happens if someone were to install a slider, or they weren't conveying that historical representation with the...
Yeah, so the tax credit programs are all or nothing. So if you take the front, especially, it's cumulative, I will say that. So if you were to replace a window on a back of a building, that might not sink your project. If you took an original double hung window or picture window with a transom on the front of a building and replace it with a vinyl slider, you would have to either replace it again with something that was more historically appropriate, or you would not be getting any tax credits on anything, because it is an all or nothing approval process.
So let's talk about the approval process for a second. How does that work?
Yep. So like I mentioned, the 30-day review. When I get an application, I have 30 days to do my initial review. I don't usually take anywhere near 30 days, but then I provide comments back, and I kind of always tell people, if you don't want my input, you can elect to just send it off to the National Park Service. Don't recommend that because my job is to help you have an approvable project. So we kind of usually do a little back and forth where I ask questions, ask them to elaborate a little bit more. Then we send it off to the National Park Service. They do have a review fee that's based on a calculation related to your project, your estimated project costs, and you pay half up front and then half at the end if you continue down the road. And so then the Park Service has 30 days. They usually take right around 30 days. They may have similar back and forth questions, or it might just be a flat out approved exactly as proposed. It might be a flat out absolutely not denied, which ideally we don't get. Like, I would hopefully have stopped them before then. But then oftentimes we get a conditional pre-approval or a conditional Part 2 work plan approval. So the Park Service will say, hey, most of this sounds great, but we need you to change these 2 items and either come back to us with a plan, or this is how you need to do it. And so that's a pretty common part for that work plan approval is a conditional approval on a Part 2. And then at the end of it, when the project is completely done, it's a Part 3 application where you basically just submit after photographs demonstrating that hopefully you did what you said you were going to do and got approval for. And then the same thing, 30 days in our office, 30 days in their office. Second half of that review fee, and then hopefully it's just a final approval. Sometimes there is remedial work items that have to be done, similar to the conditional approval on the 4 application. That's pretty rare though.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of parties involved, and I think it sounds more daunting than it might actually be, because
yeah,
said Amber, you're very much so part of the conversations before it gets to stage 2, and hopefully by that point you've already worked out some of the kinks, and I think ultimately everyone is more or less on the same page, right? I think a lot of these developers, historic preservation wasn't in the front of their mind. With these incentives and these programs, it can put one of their projects in the money, so to speak, if it's done a certain way. And working with you and working with the National Park Service and perhaps a consultant as well, there's a real opportunity for these buildings to be preserved and to be brought up to 21st century standards where they can be enjoyed by the community.
For another 100 years. Yep.
Another 100 years, and hopefully longer too.
Yeah, definitely. I would say the application process is tedious. It's not hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a lot of the times people hire, or developers will hire a consultant to do the application process for them, just because it's time consuming. You have to pay, there's attention to detail that's required in terms of taking enough photos and labeling them appropriately. And because the application has to be in such a way that the reviewers in DC who will probably never come to the actual building can understand what's happening, and that they can see what's being conveyed in terms of the existing character of the building, the existing layout, things like that, and then understand enough detail about the proposed work plan that they can feel comfortable saying, yeah, that sounds like it meets the requirements. So hiring a consultant's not required, but I often encourage it, especially if somebody is very busy and just doesn't have the time to sit down and really can commit the time to all the details.
And as you said, it is a very tedious process and you need to be very detail oriented. We've had some conversations with folks in the past who will casually say, yes, we're considering buying a historic building, and then we'll take advantage of the tax credits, or we'll utilize those tax credits. And I think if a group has never gone through the process before, they don't really understand what it takes to be able to secure those tax credits. So out of curiosity, for some of these newer groups who you've worked with and have actually gone through the process of buying a historic building or converting it, getting it on the register, and now they're at the point where they're trying to determine how to utilize the incentives. Have there been situations where you've explained, hey, you really have to historically preserve this building. You can't just renovate it as you would an ordinary shell of a building. So like, walk us through maybe some stories you have or some advice that you can provide to some groups who may be newer to this concept.
I mean, honestly, if anyone's interested, my first piece of advice is please just reach out, because we can have an initial conversation about, okay, does this even make sense? Do you meet any of the requirements? And then the second part is that we'll have a conversation about the work plan. And I like to have a conversation first and then set up a site visit pretty quickly afterwards, because I want to hear what they're thinking in terms of what they think they need to do to the building in order to make it work for their project, but also what they think needs to be done in order to take care of it, which sometimes we don't agree on. If they want to do something that just doesn't make sense with the program at all, I want to have that conversation early on so we don't waste anybody's time, right? I don't want them to think that they're going to get tax credits if nothing in their work plan is actually going to make sense. But so then we do a site visit as long as that initial conversation goes well. We have an architect on staff who is trained in historic preservation methods. So the two of us usually will go out and we'll walk the property with the developer, even if they haven't officially come into ownership, if they're still just in their due diligence phase, we often do site visits during that period because they're trying to figure out, if this is going to work. And so we're happy to do that. I'm pretty mindful with trying to get site visits turned around pretty quickly with these projects, because I know there's usually a 30-day window that we have to really figure out if this is going to make sense. So we do a site visit and we just walk around the whole building and ask a million questions and say, what do you think about the windows? What do you need to replace electrical? What's going on with the HVAC? How do you feel about these wood floors? Like we ask all the questions we can think of based on projects we've seen and issues that have come up. So and every building is different. So it's kind of hard to say, look out for these three things on every project because every building is so unique, but it's often, windows, original features like wood flooring and things like that. But then also, something that was really popular up until the last couple of years, I'd say it's less, is trying to expose masonry in every building, whether it was historically exposed or not. So we've had to nip that in the bud quite a bit, at least when I first started, in terms of people just want to restore the interior masonry. Like you never would have seen that interior masonry on the inside of a house or a church. So having those conversations early on is usually what makes the most successful projects. I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think it was a great answer. You mentioned that these projects can vary drastically, right? You have individual buildings and then you also have historic districts. If you can just explain the size and scale and scope of some of these projects on the smaller side to the larger side that you've specifically seen or walked or been involved in, I think that would be a great starting point for a follow-up question.
Definitely. I have seen projects as small as $50,000. And then the largest project I've seen was, for those familiar with the Intermountain West and Salt Lake in particular, the Evo brand has done a few developments. They did one in Denver, they did one in Salt Lake. They took half a block essentially of warehouses in our Granary warehouse historic district in Salt Lake City, in downtown Salt Lake, and did, I think it was a $26 million project, about 19 or 20 million of which were qualified costs. So 20% of that was the tax credit they got. So that's the largest projects I've seen, but they really do span all sizes. Other states I know have had bigger projects than that, but I think that's probably the largest one we've had. We have a lot of apartment buildings, both historic apartment buildings and things getting converted into apartment buildings. So offices, warehouses, things like that. That has a lot to do with the fact that our state credit is for residential buildings. And so you can combine them for housing, which is very helpful. But so we see the most apartments, but we also had like a tiny gas station that was turned into a photography studio in rural northern Utah. Yeah, just kind of a range.
So I think this is a good segue. We've just been speaking about the federal program, and I know you just mentioned the state program. As you mentioned before, all different states have all different programs, right? I'm sure there's a ton of overlap, but I'm sure there's a ton that doesn't overlap as well, including the percentage of credit that you can get at a state level. Can you give us a little more insight into how both federal and state are able to intermingle with one another and stack on top?
Definitely. I can speak most to the Utah situation, but I do know, I think I want to say close to 40 of the states out of the 50, obviously, have their own type of state historic tax credit program. They're all extremely different. Some other states are like ours, where it's residential credit. Sometimes that can be owner occupied. Sometimes it has to be residential rental. There are, I think there's at least one state that it's a property tax reduction rather than an income tax credit. There are some that are solely income producing, so they pair directly with the federal. If you get federal, or you automatically get the state. There's a whole variety of them out there. But so if in Utah in particular, we have a residential credit that can be used for both residential rental and owner occupied. So we see a lot of single family houses use it in our local historic districts, especially in Salt Lake City. That's probably the most common use that we have of the state tax credit. But like I said, because it can be paired with the federal for apartment buildings, that's our second most common use of it for sure. And it makes a really good opportunity to stack different credits and different, create a capital stack with 20% state tax credit, 20% federal tax credit, low income housing tax credits, solar tax credits. We did a webinar a couple of years ago where a couple developers came in and just sort of showed us their pro formas, where they had a loan, they had a grant, they had a mortgage, they showed the whole stack that make a project happen. And so 20% state, 20% federal, usually a pretty sizable portion of that stack.
And based off of how the credits work, that 40%, that is 40% off of the qualified improvements that you were mentioning before.
They're equivalent to 40% of your qualified costs. So say you have a $120,000 project, $100,000 were qualified expenses, you'd be looking at 20% state tax, $20,000 state tax credit, $20,000 federal tax credit. So the credit is equivalent to 20 to 40% of your qualified costs. There we go. Finally got it out. So sometimes you have qualified or costs that aren't qualified, like typically landscaping, site work, building an addition. The addition will still have to meet preservation standards and be done in a way that is approved, but the cost of building the addition would not be a qualified expense. Most of the other costs though, upgrading your HVAC, replacing if that approved, or restoring windows, replacing a roof, all of those things. Even sometimes building partition walls inside, if you're trying to divide up space a little differently, only a certain amount of that's allowed, just depending on where it's at. But say in a basement, if you're trying to create an apartment in a basement, pretty all the work that you would need to do down there would typically be an eligible expense. So 20 to 40% of those expenses, your credit would be equivalent to that.
And now I think something very important to identify is that this is a credit, a tax credit.
Yes.
So can you go into a little more
Yeah,
detail as to what that means and what groups are ultimately doing with this credit?
absolutely. Yeah. So a credit is better than a deduction. And those two are usually intermingled and they get confused. A deduction reduces your taxable income and thereby reduces your taxes owed. A credit directly reduces your taxes owed. So dollar for dollar reduction. If you earn a $10,000 tax credit and you have a $10,000 tax liability, it wipes the whole thing out. At least if for the state program, it would work that way. For the federal program, you have to split it up over a minimum of 5 years, ever since 2017. It's a reduction in your tax liability. They're both non-refundable credits, and that doesn't mean you don't get it back as a refund, because you probably do. It means you can only get back up to your annual net liability for a given year. But if you don't use it all in that first year, you can roll it forward for an additional 5 years at the state level here in Utah, and for an additional 16 years after you split it up over a minimum of 5 years at the federal level. So 21 years total at the federal level if you needed to. If you can claim it all in that first 5 years at the federal level, you can. If you can claim it all in that first year at the state level, you can. But non-refundable, so you can't. So if you don't have an income tax liability, you by yourself can't take advantage of it. There is the opportunity, at least at the federal level, to engage in a process called syndication, where maybe a nonprofit entity who wants to do a project partners with an investor who has a tax liability. And I won't get into the details of the legal happenings that have to happen, but they essentially become a part owner, I believe. And so they will provide the investor will provide the upfront capital for a certain percentage of the credit, and then the credit goes to them instead of the nonprofit. It kind of depends on whether the market, how much they pay in exchange for the credits. I think at one point it was kind of 100%. They would give you capital for the whole credit. I've heard it's been as low as 70% more recently. Kind of just depends on what's going on in the broader market.
And are you seeing groups sell these credits from one group to another? Is that
so? They are not. There is no legal mechanism to sell either the state or the federal credit in Utah. So the federal credit can't be sold. There are other states who have state credits that can be sold or transferred. It's something that was attempted to be done for the state credit in Utah a few years ago at a transferability clause. It didn't make it through the legislature, but it could happen in the future.
Got it. Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to understand. So back to the conversation regarding consultants, I can understand why it might be helpful to engage a consultant prior to starting down the path of historic preservation, for these credits especially.
I would say the biggest thing is to have an open mind. If you are dead set on doing a project exactly how you've always done it before, it's probably not going to be a great fit. If you're open to, receiving input on how you go about things and working with somebody who maybe knows a little bit more about how this all works, I would say you could be fine even if you've never done this before. But if you're not open to constructive feedback, I guess it's kind of hard to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a majority of groups are and would be open to constructive feedback. I think something that they really need to bring to the table is flexibility and improvisation. Obstacles and hurdles are thrown in their way every day, and they have to figure out how to overcome them. So I think having you, Amber, as a resource is incredible. And it sounds like you are very involved in Utah with these projects. Do you know if every state has an Amber or a team of Ambers?
So technically, yes. Technically, every state has somebody dedicated to reviewing either their state program or their federal program or both. Some of the larger states that have higher volume projects, not necessarily geographically larger, but just higher volume projects, have teams, have multiple reviewers. I would say it definitely varies state by state how involved the reviewer is. I would say I'm probably one of the more hands-on reviewers, just because I don't have as many projects as, say, like New York or Kansas. I know Kansas, maybe Missouri, they just the way that their different programs stack, they have huge workload. So it's harder for them to go out and do as much, I don't want to say hand holding, but as much facilitation as maybe I do. So it kind of just depends. But there is a point of contact in every state who is tasked with helping developers navigate this process.
Great. That's really great information. Amber, is there anything else that you'd want to share with us right now as it relates to the program or the programs at a federal level, a state level?
Kind of a sidebar, I just myself got certified to teach a continuing education course for realtors, for real estate agents, at least in Utah. That's start there, but to try to help them understand historic designation, the incentives that come with that, and the different programs that are available, particularly the tax credits. And then our office is also trying, hopefully working on trying to get it confirmed in August, going to be do a training for developers that's a little bit more, a deeper dive into the tax credit programs and the requirements and how to apply the preservation standards. We'll have our architect there talking about building code and how it can be applied to historic buildings differently than new construction. So we're planning that for August, but then I also will be doing some continuing education courses for realtors as soon as I can get that launched as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, I love how you and your team and Chris focus so specifically on education, right? And I think trying to empower whomever it is with knowledge so that they can be better equipped is ultimately the way that everyone can succeed as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge focus.
Chris, anything you'd like to add? Anything that you'd like folks to better understand when it comes to historic preservation?
I think I just want to end with, the whole point of these programs, especially Amber's programs, are a carrot approach to preservation. It is meant to incentivize people doing good things by the historic buildings. And yes, a lot of what Amber talked about, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of expectation because you're getting a big credit for doing the work and preserving your community's history. And so the bar of which you need to meet is a bit higher than if you weren't asking for a tax credit. But using a tax credit offers up that accessibility to skilled professionals that can help you get your project to a completion that is both benefiting you as an owner or developer, but also benefiting that community by preserving something that otherwise would be knocked down or replaced with something not as interesting. The whole point of historic preservation is keeping those stories within that community preserved. And as a preservationist, we really believe that the tangible part of history is what conveys those stories. And the tax credit program and local government grants and all these other things are all nested in a way to encourage the public and developers to preserve these places. And we know here in Utah, we have incredible growing pains. We have a lot of development pressures in our urban areas as our population grows, as the economy changes. But we do feel fundamentally that there are historic places that deserve to be preserved because it makes this community different than the next community over. And when Amber gets a successful project, it always gets picked up in the press. It always gets picked up in the local community because people love to see success stories. And so as folks in the world are looking for opportunities, you're helping preserve a piece of that community's history. That is the fundamental part of what you're doing. And these programs are just there to help you make it pencil a little bit better.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way of putting it. Ultimately, it is great when everyone wins. The community preserves that piece of history. A building that might not have been operational becomes serviceable and able to be used by the public. And a developer is able to profit off of the development. And ideally, they can then redeploy that capital into the next building that they can help preserve and bring that life back to the community or help advance the community even further. So I think these are all really interesting points that have been brought up, and ultimately we're aligned with your approach. And as I see it, that is to educate. If we can empower more developers to better understand these programs, be more audacious with their ability to maybe get involved into projects that ordinarily they wouldn't look at because they thought, hey, it's too much of a headache and not enough return at the end of that headache, to say, hey, ultimately this could be a way for us to do good by our investors, do good by the community, and build a legacy by preserving these buildings. So this has been super helpful, super eye-opening. Amber, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you would want to leave whomever decides to listen to this video with?
I just think that we can always accomplish more working together. And we are as a resource as much as every other state has resources. We rely on our developer partners and our contractor partners to do the work that preservation can't do through government. And so it's really a partnership that we want to engage in. We're a resource, we're a partner, we want to see success. And every SHPO wants a success in their community, and the National Park Service wants to see success in preservation. And so the more we can open up dialogue early in these projects, the better their project will be at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I echo all of what Chris said. I would say it's not something to sleep on, right? If it's a program that you think you're interested in, just reach out. Having the conversation early often is going to lead to the most success.
Awesome. Communication. We love that. But, this was amazing, right? Like, thank you guys, truly. And the work you're doing is phenomenal. And I'm sure oftentimes it is a thankless job, but I thank you. And I know a number of other people out there thank you. We're always happy to be a resource for you and your team, however we can. We'd love to be able to help.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Spencer.